If you haven't watched Part 1 to the Religion in Outlast 2 Trinity, the Gospel of Noth Breakdown and Analysis, it is highly recommended you do so before continuing. Trust me, things will make a lot more sense. This video contains graphic content, both fictional and real life. Please enjoy.
Hello, I'm Nick Carlson, guest host for the hit TV series Mysterious Mysteries, filling in for Regis Philbin. Somewhere deep in the Arizonan desert, there is a town built on a foundation of blood, lies, and religious bastardization. And you're probably sitting at home thinking, psh, towns in deserts? What a load of baloney. Well, sit back down, ladies and gentlemen, because I myself visited and fully documented such a town. Every solitary detail, demographics, philosophies, character profiles, and even a few theories, if you can believe it. Will you venture into the unknown with me? And will you emerge unscathed from the corrupt, shadowy depths of Temple Gate?
Founded in 1971, Temple Gate is a religious commune located within the Havasupai Indian Reservation in northwest Arizona, formed from the displaced remnants of Sullivan Noth's cult, the Testament of the New Ezekiel, after their flight from Albuquerque in 1969. The commune is laid within a canyon system, threaded by a river and several tributaries, providing a constant source of water that leads through a conifer forest and a lake on its outskirts. This water, however, is polluted with mercury from upstream industry, contaminating their blood and requiring grape aid to mask the metallic taste. It is a farming community, the primary agricultural products being corn, beans, poultry, and beef. As there do not appear to be any firearms within Temple Gate, trapping is the preferred method of hunting as opposed to guns. The presence of smoked fish on skewers reveals they supplement their diet with what the waters provide. At the mouth of the river is an abandoned mining complex, one that is mostly untouched by the Testament. Based on the region's history, we can guess that the mine's primary export was either lead, uranium, or mercury. Despite their separation from society, which they refer to as the damned world, runners are occasionally sent out to barter or purchase more refined goods, such as paper, medicine, gasoline, electric hardware, and foodstuffs such as canned vegetables, as denoted by the apparent vendor, Spatlin's Farm. Its architecture is largely wooden, handmade structures, with various homesteads, barns, and fields bordering the town center, the heart of which features a large standalone chapel, strangely enough, considering that typical chapels are auxiliary structures for a larger building such as a school or hospital. Situated a good distance from the center of Temple Gate is a compound, modeled after a true church, where Noth and his flock engage in more confidential business, such as secret rituals, tortures, imprisonments, and the writing of new gospels. It's also likely this compound is where Noth speaks via an elaborate loudspeaker system throughout Temple Gate, including daily announcements, gospel readings, and calls to action.
God himself killed his own child.
As seen in Part 1, the theology espoused in the Gospel of Noth is a mishmash of various Christian denominations and other religions. They partake in traditional Christian sacraments such as the Eucharist, as noted by the need for sacrament, or communion wine, and penance, as noted by the confessional box in the chapel. Transubstantiation, the process of turning the host into the body and blood of Christ, a strictly Catholic belief, may be an aspect of their Eucharist, as the word is mentioned by the deacon, Laird Byron.
Ain't been transubstantiated yet.
Additionally, the sacrament of penance is a solely Catholic ritual, as Catholics believe that sins must be confessed and forgiven in order to ready the soul for heaven. Despite these Catholic invocations, the rest of Temple Gate's beliefs and practices spec more towards what we see in Protestantism. For starters, their splitting off from the rest of the Christian faith and following the Gospel of Noth falls in line with Martin Luther's concept of sola scriptura, where God's only book is the sole governing authority, as opposed to Catholics, who, along with the Bible, also follow the canonicity of the Roman Catholic Church. Additionally, while there are a few statues of the Virgin Mary throughout Temple Gate, veneration does not appear to be a part of their faith. The only figure portrayed with saint-like iconography throughout Temple Gate is Noth himself. It's likely they hold the Protestant views that simply having faith in God is enough to bestow sainthood and guarantee salvation, as they commit murder and suicide in God's name, acts that Catholics would see as mortal sins that sever a person's connection with God's grace. To seal the deal, one of the deacon Val's notes mentions Noth along with the congregation singing about gathering on the river, which is almost certainly a reference to the hymn, Shall We Gather at the River, a historically Baptist composition. So it could be inferred that the Testament's practice of Christianity is outwardly Catholic and inwardly Protestant. But what makes the Testament stand out is their practice of human sacrifice, first referenced in chapter 1 of the Gospel of Noth. While they are keen to distinguish their version of sacrifice from the pagan sacrifices to Sumerian deities, the fact remains they are still cleaving flesh and spilling blood for a god. Just their god. Flesh is likened to grass, fertilized by blood, and the spreading of both, in the name of God, is seen as a holy work. The primary impetus for this act is the Gospel's proclamation that one child conceived among their flock would be the Antichrist. Although the same text claims that the Antichrist would have to be slain within the womb, it would appear that as the decades went on, the criteria on who could be the Antichrist loosened to include young children, perhaps up to 8 years old. As seen in Temple Gate's schoolhouse, kids are conditioned to believe that they themselves might be the enemy, and that their lives are contingent on the will of Papa Noth, and ultimately on the will of God. The Bible stories they're taught, Jonah and the whale, Jesus in the desert, and Abraham killing Isaac in his heart, all feature some spin on God's will superseding that of man's. However, this doesn't mean the text's original interpretation was disregarded. Throughout Temple Gate, we see evidence of infant sacrifice, most notably within a chamber on the outskirts of town, its exterior labeled Satanas Inimical Dei, or Satan, enemy of God. The bloodied manger within implies that newly born babies are placed immediately within the cradle and slain, the corpses subsequently tossed in a mass grave, while participants sing a hymn entitled Midwife's Lament. Even so, as seen with Ethan's daughter, Anna Lee, sometimes pregnant women would be killed in order to slay the fetuses before they could see the light. And worse still, pregnant women would believe that their intense pains were signs that their children were the enemy and throw themselves into a communal spike pit to snuff out both the Antichrist and the lasting sting of their past sins. Older children were sacrificed in more elaborate ways. A boy named Daniel was blinded with a lie before his death. Another boy named Marcus had his throat slit by Deacon Val upon a pyre, in the presence of Noth and his congregation, and a girl named Juliana became aware of her eventual fate, begging her parents in a handwritten note for her life to be spared. Such heinous acts are rationalized not just in the Testament's belief that one of their kin might be the Antichrist, but in Noth's claims that all slain children are soldiers in God's army, killed in the fight against impending evil, and that their parents would be reunited with them in heaven, uninjured and immaculate in form. And it's not just children. Strewn throughout Temple Gate are the various bodies of adults murdered by their fellow laypeople. Although the more random, graceless nature of their deaths, along with the Testament's ideations of purity and faith, suggests they were killed for improper devotion, offending the prophet, or suspicion that they were heretics. After all, in Temple Gate, even something as simple as wasting paper results in blood punishment. Yet none of these acts are as outlandish as the supposedly divine intervention the Testament experiences. The commune is sporadically barraged with a blinding disembodied light that induces the dreams that walk outside of sleep, as noted in chapter 12 of the Gospel of Noth. These dreams dredge up traumatic, suppressed memories, claimed by the Gospels to be past sins rising in preparation for the dead rising for paradise, a sign of the encroaching end times. Victims continue to experience these vivid flashbacks in their sleep, even without stimulus from the light. In extreme cases, the light drives the afflicted into states of somnambulant frenzies, walking great distances without knowledge of it happening, or even spontaneously poisoning themselves to death. But it would appear that there might be something else hidden in the light. A man named John reported seeing insects, mouths, and phalluses amid the light's many visions. A woman named Lisa, mother of the blinded child Daniel, wrote of her sexual encounter with an apocalyptic entity in the midst of one of her walking dreams, bearing an uncanny resemblance to the fleeting vision witnessed by Noth in chapter 5 of the Gospel, before it became the tetramorph as seen by Ezekiel. Roman cultists consistently quote chapter 5 in a fearful tone, citing the entity's wings and jaws inseparable even in sight. And a child's drawing of a six-armed creature only corroborates the consistency of the entity's presence among the cult. And as we'll see later on, encounters with this entity are not confined solely to the Testament. It can be reasonably assumed that in 1971, the Testament of the New Ezekiel had a diverse collection of members, presumably cut from a representative swath of New Mexico. As long as they were willing to follow Noth and adhere to his gospel, all were welcome. However, decades of infighting, disease, and ritualistic culling had severely affected Temple Gate's populace by 2013. In the last days of its reign, the area undoubtedly had more corpses than warm bodies. Yet we can still infer from the fragments a semblance of structure and demographics. At the top of the pyramid is Sullivan Noth, the apocalyptic prophet and holy figure among the cult. His flock reverently dubs him Papa, and he enacts this fatherly persona in authoritative and familial terms. It is unclear whether the cult had ordained priests who could celebrate Mass, but Noth would definitely adopt the role of pastor for these services. The closest historical parallel to Noth is obviously Jim Jones, the cult leader who founded the People's Temple in 1955 and established Jonestown in 1974. Jones propped a belief system he dubbed Apostolic Socialism, where socialism was the logical conclusion of enlightenment reached by a constant drugging of the opiate of religion, a play on Karl Marx's infamous take. Like Noth, Jones castigated traditional Christianity as promoting an incorrect view of God. Unlike Noth, however, he also criticized the Bible as a tool to oppress minorities, and viewed himself as God, as opposed to Noth's image as an enlightened prophet. Yet Jones's followers also referred to him as Father or Dad, as to them, he was the only figure who mattered in the world. Both also preached an oncoming apocalypse, claiming that only those who detached from the damned world and followed him would be saved. And both met their ends by believing all hope had been lost, killing their own flocks to spare them the end of days, before offering themselves on their own terms. Second in command to Noth were at least two deacons, Laird Byron and Val, the latter of whom was among Noth's most trusted and beloved disciples before her defection. Along with administering rites, deacons would also act as liaisons for Noth, such as permitting lay people to use paper for purposes other than copying the gospel. By late 2013, it would seem that Noth had no deacons left. However, he did have a number of black-hooded confidants, and a handful of especially devoted helpers who joined him in his more cutting interactions. In a unique position on the hierarchy is Marta, a lone enforcer whose murderous inclination is so intense, she sparks fear in even the most devoted cultists. She operates a meat processing facility on the outskirts of Temple Gate, but otherwise she acts as an emissary for Noth's will, roaming Temple Gate and slaying those accused of heresy. It is unclear when she joined the Testament. However, Noth had known her since she was a child, and it's possible that in her gaunt appearance and large size, presumably evident even in her early years, she would become the archetype for the wimple-garbed warriors bearing weapons that censor, as referenced in Noth chapter 10. It is also unclear whether there were more warriors like her before 2013, but even so, she holds a special place in Noth's eyes. Another observation is that despite Noth's liberal sexual relations with the women of Temple Gate, he never laid with Marta, nor did she ever take any partners, as one of her voice lines mentions shed blood being a token of her virginity.
Your blood shall be the tokens of my virginity.
A parallel to this might exist in ancient Rome, where the Vestal virgins were priestesses who maintained the titular goddess's hearth, chosen at a young age and required to remain chaste throughout their tenure. Whether Marta engaged in priestly rites herself is, again, unknown, but it's logical to assume that virginity was highly valued to her, a reflection of her avenging purity. Lowest on the rung, and most numerous in Temple Gate, are the lay people. Again, by 2013, the populace had been reduced to a handful of older men and women in their late 40s at the very youngest. They are largely farmers, maintaining their livestock and crops when they're not performing communal duties, such as construction and maintenance, supply runs, or attending holy services. While they're permitted to marry and have children of their own, it is always with the stipulation that their lives ultimately belong to Noth. This is noted in the fact that even girls as young as 15 could be found with the Testament's insignia tattooed on their chests. Children, if suspected to be the Antichrist, would be killed on Noth's whim. And this is something that would have been impressed on them at a young age, as noted in their school curriculum. The women are just as much Noth's property as the children. As it is said in the Gospel, they are encouraged to rut with Noth on demand, as readily as they would with their husbands. Even in 2013, men outnumber women by a considerable degree, the remaining ones besides Marta among the oldest. Presumably, the younger women were killed along with their babies, under suspicion that they were carrying the Antichrist, or exiled, or maybe just executed for being hot, which basically did happen many times in history. Contained among the populace of Temple Gate was a virulent and unknown STD, foreshadowed in chapter 12 of the Gospel of Noth, another sign of the end times. The affliction is compared to syphilis and gonorrhea, both of which are caused by sexually transmitted bacteria that induce necrotic sores across the body, particularly the eyes, mouth, and genitals, along with nausea, delirium, and, with advanced cases, paralysis from the waist down, rendering the most heavily stricken into zombie-like lepers. It is unclear when it first made landfall in Temple Gate, but at a point when it became too widespread to dismiss, Noth deemed the plague an affliction of the soul, adamant that it was a result of patients' lack of faith, and exiled them to a sick camp in a neighboring valley, assuring that penance and continued devotion would cure them. One of his deacons, Laird Byron, along with his mount, Nick Tremblay, would also present symptoms, and be sent down to the camp to keep the afflicted in line and tend to their needs. The Testament would continue to send them supplies, but the so-called Scald are still seen as pariahs to be avoided at all costs. However, even as recently as 2013, some Testament members could still be observed with inflamed rashes on their mouths, implying that, despite their best efforts, the epidemic remained in Temple Gate until the end. And this should come as no surprise, considering Sullivan Noth himself is the apparent source of this disease. With his unfettered copulation among Temple Gate's women, the plague could spread unchecked among the lay people, and Noth's insistence that the penicillin he buys from the outside world is actually study aids exacerbates the deception. It's clear Noth would not let anything get in the way of his gospel duty and impression of holiness, even something as grievous as a sexually transmitted plague originating from his own manhood. While the Scald are simply diseased former members of the Testament, they stand out in that they have their own gospel, entitled The Gospel of the Scald Christ. This document, more a chapter-length anecdote written by Laird, details how the afflicted deacon visited Noth one day asking to share in his holy visions, to seek divine inspiration for himself and the Scald. Noth informs Laird that his mind is unprepared to receive the Lord as he himself can, but promises that Laird's faith will ensure that revelation would come unto him. Laird is suddenly stricken with a vision, that of a pristine Messiah descending on a cloud of locusts and curing the Scald of their ills, immediately confirmed by Noth. Laird attests that the Messiah would be crucified, and his death would induce a flowing spring of milk, wine, butter, and liquor for the Scald to feast upon. Then, after his burial, the Messiah would rise again, and invite the Scald to consume his flesh, thus curing their diseases. Throughout the Gospel, Laird presents himself as vainglorious and a beacon of salvation, even casting his own fellow Scald as wretched sinners who deserve to be punished and ordered around. However, as seen in a mock prayer written by one of the Scald, in which they proclaim Laird leading them to damnation as opposed to salvation, it's clear many of them have long lost their faith in the gospel of the Scald Christ. The final sign of the end times prophesied by the Gospel of Noth promises that one of his closest disciples would have their heart touched by the enemy, and they would evoke a schism, splitting off from the Testament and reveling in sinful pleasures. And in March 2013, someone did just that. Before then, Val, the second of Noth's two confirmed deacons, was one of Noth's most trusted confidants, a devoted follower and secret keeper for Temple Gate. Among Val's parochial duties was the caretaking of over 40 orphaned children, whose parents had either died or been exiled. Despite the strain of watching over so many children, Val loved them unconditionally, as their parents would have. And yet, this crop of orphans would prove most fruitful for Noth, as in the beginning of March, the child sacrifices would increase in frequency, up to 6 per day. Val was the one who had slit their throats, an act that disturbed her greatly, to the point of questioning God's presence in such atrocities. Eventually, she would come to interpret God's silence as a message itself. If God's love cannot be felt in the slaughter of children, then how could it compare to Val's love, tormented and throttled with each killing? To her, the love she felt became more powerful than anything God could offer.
God doesn't love you. Not like I do.
As Val's flock thinned further, she began to poke holes in the Testament's beliefs, noting the hypocrisy between Noth's assurance that all slain children are soldiers in God's army, and Noth's claims that their sins find them in their dreams, with Val's dreams being the very thing Noth says is their godly duty. And Val would come to abandon the God she'd grown up with, and interpret her dreams as messages from something else. Later in the month, Val would connect with other cultists having similar visions and doubts, and stake a hideout so they could discuss their dreams in private. And the more they convened, the bolder and more assured Val would become in her dissent. She would begin actively recruiting Testament members to defect, tempting them with physical indulgences. As noted by a woman named Ruth's letter, Val allegedly offered her something secretive and sexual in nature, with veiled references to Ruth's genitals. In the following weeks, Val's betrayal would be made apparent. She and her followers fled to the abandoned mines and carved out a pagan commune, sending a letter to Noth calling him a liar, coward, and plague spreader, proclaiming that his god is a lie and hers is no god at all. Noth would respond by commissioning his enforcer Marta to hunt down Val and the heretics and kill them without mercy, and by writing a furiously scrawled addition to chapter 11 of his gospel, a retelling of chapter 13, explicitly naming Val as the traitor's disciple, and promising that God's wrath on her and the heretics would be immeasurable in pain and suffering. Despite that, Noth would attempt to reach Val one more time, claiming that he still loved her even though she'd strayed, assuring that she's trapped in Satan's grasp, and that the Testament would show mercy and forgiveness if she surrendered. Regardless if Val saw past this deception, or simply refused to acknowledge him any further, she and her flock would disappear, and engage in civil war with the rest of Temple Gate. Delving into Val and the heretics' ideologies first requires a look at the man whose work inspired their design. Olivier de Segazan is a French biologist turned artist and sculptor whose performance, Transfiguration, features a striking visceral look at what he deems a frenzied search for new essence and form. He morphs into various figures made out of clay, paint, and sticks, each visage more distinct than the last. De Segazan's work is about the malleability of form, the folly of sedentary perspective, and how even life's most grotesque expressions can still be beautiful. I can't think of a more succinct summation of the heretic's philosophy. In stark opposition to the Testament's gospels and sacraments and dogma, the heretics believe that true purpose exists in the pursuit of sensual pleasure, rooted in humankind's deepest, most shameless desires. While the Testament shunned and repressed sex, treating it as a dutiful, rigid act under the whim of their prophet, the heretics swung the pendulum the other way, reveling in sexuality without limitations. To them, love is an ingrained, pure expression of humanity, that no imposed boundaries or standards have any right to inhibit. If one feels love, it is always good, all the time, and to repress or restrict it would be a travesty. After all, a message scrawled in blood on a cliffside claims, "Love set us free." Val's gender identity is a prime example of this. Examination of her character model reveals a mangled protrusion of flesh where a set of male genitals once were, and the disproportionate breasts and labia suggest they were merely sculpted onto her body with mud. Additionally, Noth and the rest of Temple Gate refer to Val with male pronouns. It is unclear whether Val identified as female throughout her whole life, or if the Testament actually knew and refused to acknowledge her as female. Regardless, Val did hold a more traditionally maternal role in her time as a Temple Gate deacon by caretaking the orphans, and it can be assumed that her defection from Temple Gate is what finally prompted her self-castration. While Val identifies as female, a distinction between male and female is not her impetus. Val's transition is more a statement on her belief of fluidity, that love is not confined solely between a man and a woman with male and female genitals. To her, even something as fundamental as bodily flesh ought not to impede love or sexuality. As long as you are able to love, and willing to express that love, it matters not who you are on the outside. You are but a vessel for pleasure, and that pleasure ought to be shared with your fellow vessels. In fact, Red Barrels themselves delivered what could be interpreted as the final word on the matter. Val is Val. Despite that, there's no doubt that Val and the Heretic's expressions of love are unhealthy and immoral, and there's no greater example of this than Val's attempt to assault protagonist Blake in the depths of the mines. To Val, love isn't just something to share, it's also something to give and receive, even by force. To Val, to be without love is a fate worse than sexual assault. While the Heretic's theology is not as outspoken as the Testament's, there are clues we can draw throughout the game's story. Their deity is undoubtedly Lucifer, the fallen angel cast from God's grace, confirmed by heretic Josiah's desperate mantra amid his wife's torture.
Strengthen the rebellious angel. I have no fear. Strength. Enemy of my...
Lucifer is depicted in one of their subterranean temples as a massive winged entity cradling a newborn, crafted and woven out of plant matter, a reflection of the heretic's more positive, albeit twisted, impressions of childbearing and fertility. In terms of rituals, we see the mass orgy partaken in celebration of the Antichrist's arrival, and a note describes an act where a man's tongue was bitten off by another man in some sort of intense intimate act. We can also infer they live in a fairly classless, disorderly manner, Val being the only figure of distinction who can lead and control them. They communicate in a strange tongue, a mix of broken English, other phrases in random languages, and outright animalistic gibberish. Otherwise, they're perfectly content doing their own thing, living and loving in incoherent bliss. The heretic's nudity combined with their cosmetic modifications is again reflective of their views on love. It's not enough to cast away garments, thus embracing the taboo of nakedness. One must also change themselves to fully understand and receive love to the highest degree. In this case, it's invoking the image of their lord, Lucifer, who showed them that truth in the first place. Anton LaVey was an author and musician who founded the Church of Satan and popularized the modern, secularized version of Satanism we see today. LaVey characterized Satan not as the embodiment of evil, but as a symbol of rebellion and independent thought. LaVey and Satanists promote nonconformity, hedonism, and radical individualism, a contrast to the values imposed upon by mainstream society and religions. And far from an external entity, Satan is likened as an expression of the individual's true self, unmoored by convention or arbitrary dogma, the true God within us all. Not only do the heretics embody these values in opposition to the Testament, but their belief in expressing Lucifer via their outward appearance, despite being theistic in nature, has uncanny parallels. Interestingly enough, the same entity that haunts the Testament also seems to visit the heretics in their dreams, albeit this one is presumably also acknowledged as Lucifer. Val's most recent journal entries invite Lucifer to enter her, cut her, and burn her, likening herself to a membrane-seeking penetration. Neither faction seems to speak much of these incidents, but it can be inferred that while the Testament looks upon their encounters with shame and fear, Val and the heretics welcome it as a fundamental aspect of their belief, thus explaining their apparent lack of acknowledgement. Their consuming, destroying, pleasuring God is just as commonplace as love itself. As Outlast 2 is keen to show, not everyone in Temple Gate going through a religious crisis is actually from Temple Gate. Enough has been said about our protagonist, Blake Langerman, a hapless hero without any special skills, thrust into hell on earth to save his wife, with nothing but sheer willpower and endurance. Ignoring the debates on who suffered more compared to other Outlast protagonists, there is a deep profundity to his story that meshes beautifully with the other themes and narratives unfurling in Temple Gate. Amid the chases, the tortures, and the debilitating trauma, Blake's journey is a microcosm of biblical imagery and invocations. Even from the chapter selection screen, the parallels are obvious. Genesis covers Blake's romp through Temple Gate, his introduction to the Testament of the New Ezekiel, the beginning of his psychological collapse, and the formal establishment of this world's mythology. Job covers Blake's journey through the Scald camp, the boils, sickness, and suffering around him mirroring the titular prophet Job's plight in the eponymous book. Lamentations, a book mourning the fall of Jerusalem, mirrors the isolation and ruin Blake finds himself in around the lakeside, and the horrific discovery of what's really been driving Temple Gate to destruction. Judges, concerning the Israelites' lack of faith landing them in the hands of the enemy, parallels Blake's descent into the mines where the heretics reside. Leviticus covers the outlandish rituals Val and the heretics perform in the mines, just as the biblical book conveys the various rituals God delivered unto Moses. And Revelations, well, end-of-the-world type shit. But more interesting is the messianic invocations surrounding Blake Langerman. The obvious example unfurls when Blake is deemed the Skald Messiah, crucified, and then inadvertently fulfills the Gospel of the Skald Christ's predictions, sporting stigmata to boot. More broadly speaking, however, Blake's arrival in Temple Gate heralds not just Antichrist's arrival, but every event as prophesied in the Gospel of Noth, chapter 12. Locusts, boils, bodies choking the surface of the water, and blood rain. Whether Blake meant to or not, he had become Temple Gate's Messiah.
Body so thick I could have walked across the water on their backs. It's almost funny. That's how you walk on water.
It's not as straightforward as other Messiah stories, however. I'm unsure if there's a similar trope in fiction, but I'd like to coin a term for what Blake represented in Outlast 2. The Burning Messiah. This describes an outsider in a strange, hostile environment who, usually unwittingly, sparks a massive upheaval within said environment, completely overturning what its residents assume to be stable and true. By the end of the journey, the environment is unrecognizable, the residents have had their faith shaken, and the supposed Messiah... Actually, I don't know how it typically ends, let's just say it can vary. Fun fact, I found Blake's Burning Messiah journey in Outlast 2 so poignant that it inspired the protagonist arc in my novel, Hell's Gulf. Oh yeah, I'm a published author. Links in the description. But we cannot close the book on Blake's story without addressing his more repressed issues. Within his first minutes at Temple Gate, Blake is likewise besieged by the mysterious light that scrambles the townsfolk's minds, and he too experiences his own dreams that walk outside of sleep. In his case, reliving his trauma as a 4th grade student, where his friend Jessica was abused and assaulted by a priest, Father Loudermilch, culminating in her accidental death, which he was guilted into covering up as a suicide. As Blake relives these memories, Loudermilch stalks him throughout the dreamscape, manifesting as a nude, handsy, tonguey demon, symbolic of the man's various methods of abuse, each appendage representative of the mocking Christian hymn he sings.
Father up above, and he's looking down in love, so be careful, little love, what you say.
This experience left Blake extremely sensitive about sexual matters, especially in how they intersect with religion. He comments at one point how he and his wife hadn't made love in months, and the priest's voice in his visions taunts him with his childhood insecurities of nervousness, shame, and guilt. My theory is that this seemingly bizarre line is Loudermilch throwing Blake's own thoughts back at him to further break his spirit.
Someplace safe, where you can remember the taste of her kiss when you felt her neck break, you diseased cocksucker.
The reason I bring this up is because Blake's journey also represents a twisted reckoning with his views on religion and sex. Blake starts out in a childless, passionless marriage, presumably fostered by his repressed trauma, but is flung into a scenario where his wife miraculously conceives. He is suddenly labeled the father, and is hunted down by a faction of zealots with restrictive, hostile views on sex. Despite Blake's attempts to deny his fatherhood and rebuff the zealots, he still pushes deeper, winding up in the rotten underbelly of the zealots' sexual hypocrisy, coinciding with the first encounter with the monster who traumatized and confused him as a child. Noth and Loudermilch here represent holy figures in Blake's life who used shame and guilt, in conjunction with sexuality, to attain their own satisfaction, all in pursuit of an innocent girl connected to Blake. In Loudermilch's case, Jessica, and in Noth's case, the Antichrist within Lynn's womb, denoted in chapter 14 of the Gospel of Noth as a female. Disillusioned, Blake encounters the next faction with radically different views on sex. Whereas Noth and Loudermilch were hypocrites and gatekeepers, the heretics are hedonists and indulgers, who not only welcome his child, but literally force him to endure the raw carnal implications of sex. Still, this sudden, aggressive explosion of sexuality only further reminds him of the trauma Jessica went through, culminating when he hallucinates Val whispering Father Loudermilch's dialogue to him.
Help me make this right.
Will you help me make this right?
And the transition of Val assaulting him to Jessica playfully tackling him in a memory, only further cementing this twisted connection. But it is here during this forced reckoning when Blake remembers the true story behind what happened to Jessica, and reminds himself that none of it was his fault. Despite being guilted into a horrible situation, he was only a child. Innocent, unknowing, yet freshly spoiled by the tragedy and cynicism of the world. Blake emerges from hell, purified by fire, the child of his trauma securely in his arms. His agency secured, his soul redeemed, Blake finds the will to forgive himself and become reborn. His last memory is that of an intimate moment with Jessica, joined in prayer with God. Sadly, for our hero, things don't seem like they'll remain that way. And so, the end of Part 2 draws near. But let's go revisit something you might have realized earlier back. I'm not the first to notice the similarities between the Loudermilch demon and the child's drawing in the basement of a Temple Gate house, or the homunculus as depicted in Chapter 5 of the Gospel of Noth. Sure, one cannot deny the metaphorical aspects of the demon, but let's be real. There are about 1 million different demonic forms a pedophile priest could realistically manifest as. Is it coincidence that the entity Blake encounters just so happens to superficially resemble the entity already present in Temple Gate? I don't think so. So, what's really going on in Outlast 2? Stay tuned for Part 3.
Spider, I am.